Welcome back to Module 1, Introduction to Abnormal Psychology. This is Lecture 3, the biological model. I hope the first lecture, How Do We Define Abnormal, provided you with some questions for reflection. An important point to remember is that there is no broad, clearly defined definition of psychological abnormality that can be applied to all people in all situations. Abnormality is complex, as well as situation-specific and person-specific. Its determination is often a topic of disagreement and debate. For the remainder of Module 1, we will be looking at a few major models that are used to understand and explain psychological abnormality. Each model approaches this topic differently, and as a result, each model carries different implications for treatment. In today's lecture, we will be discussing the biological model. The biological model asserts that psychological abnormality is actually a medical or biological illness that's caused by a problem in some part of the brain. While proponents of this model talk about brain anatomy, brain circuitry, and brain chemistry, we are going to focus our conversation specifically on brain chemistry. First, we need to talk a little bit about how brain chemistry works. The brain consists of about 86 billion nerve cells called neurons, and literally thousands of billions of support cells called glia. In a fundamental way, our brains operate through the communication of neurons with each other. How does this work? How do neurons communicate with each other? Messages are passed from one neuron to another through electrical impulses that travel down the length of one neuron and are picked up by another neuron. Now, it's far beyond the scope of this lecture to get into too many details about how this works, so we're going to keep it simple for now. An electrical impulse is received by a part of the neuron called a dendrite. Each neuron has many dendrites. They are extensions found at one end of the neuron that look a little bit like antennae. When a dendrite receives an electrical impulse, the impulse travels through the neuron and down to the end of the axon. The axon is a long fiber extending from one end of the neuron. It sort of looks like a long tail. The end of the axon has a structure called a nerve ending. The electrical impulse travels down the axon to the nerve ending, and from there it's transmitted to the dendrites of the next neuron. But how does that happen? Neurons do not actually touch each other. The axon of one neuron is not connected to the dendrites of another neuron. There's a space between them called the synapse. So how does the electrical impulse travel across the synapse to the next neuron? More importantly, what does this have to do with psychological abnormality? Once the electrical impulse reaches the nerve ending at the end of the axon, it releases a chemical called a neurotransmitter into the synapse. This chemical travels across the synapse and attaches itself to the dendrites of another neuron at areas called receptor sites. Once this happens, the dendrites receive the message to generate the electrical impulse, which travels down the length of the neuron to the nerve ending of the axon, where the process happens all over again. As you can imagine, the communication among neurons through electrical impulses is an incredibly fast process. There are many neurotransmitters in the brain, each with a different function. Scientists have linked some of these neurotransmitters to particular psychological disorders. For example, depression, which we will talk about in the next module, has been linked to low levels of the neurotransmitters serotonin and norepinephrine. Schizophrenia, which we will discuss in the last module, is believed to involve the neurotransmitters glutamate and dopamine. Researchers have also looked at the role of specific groupings of neurons referred to as brain circuits, as well as specific brain structures, such as the limbic system. There is a vast research base clearly showing there's a strong link between psychological disorders and problems in brain functioning. While it is beyond the scope of this lecture to delve further into the topic, it is a critically important one in the field of abnormal psychology, and I encourage you to seek out further reading if you're interested. How does a biological model of abnormal psychology approach treatment? The answer is primarily through medications, although there are other, less common forms of medical treatment still in use today. Medications used to treat psychological disorders are known as psychoactive medications, and they impact the levels of specific neurotransmitters in the brain. For example, most medications treating depression increase the presence of serotonin in the synapse, while medications treating schizophrenia decrease dopamine activity in the synapse. Medications are widely used to treat a number of psychological disorders, and as we will discuss in later modules, treatment for some disorders must involve medications in order to be considered ethical. More to come on this later.